the colonizers of Palestine were completely on the left. They were
Right.
a large portion of them were totally pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin. I mean, in ways which are kind of insane. They were pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin. They saw themselves as part of the international left.
Yeah.
Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, he imagined himself to being a Jewish Lenin.
Yeah.
That was their worldview. So it was Palestine was at that point it was a leftist cause. As you know, the Soviet Union immediately recognized the state of Israel on its creation. So it's not surprising that Du Bois, because he was in that camp, and you have to remember, there are so many historical facts that have to remember. The left was very sympathetic to the Jews because of the fight against fascism and the Nazi extermination.
Right, and the Black nationalist movement was also sympathetic for its own sort of reasons. Marcus Garvey, Du Bois, etc. I thought it was interesting, though.
Paul Robeson was the greatest defender of the Jewish people during the Nazi Holocaust. His mastery of Yiddish was breathtaking. My father, when he would listen to Paul Robeson sing in Yiddish, what came to be called the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance song, it's really the partisan song, he was mesmerized. I mean, he was mesmerized to the point that we had back then, the old-fashioned record players with the needle on the handle. And he wanted to hear it again. And he lifted the handle again, and lifted the handle again, and lifted it until he scratched the whole record.
Wow.
I mean, that was Paul Robeson. The Jewish people loved Paul Robeson, loved him because of his devotion to the Jews in the moment of their suffering. So it was a very different cause back then, or its understanding was very different back then.
For sure. I just wanted to make sure the audience didn't walk away thinking that pre sort of civil rights Civil Rights Act, or even pre, sort of 1968, I'll say, when King passes. I don't want people to think that the advocacy for the state of Israel, or even advocacy for the early Yishuv prior to 1948 was purely like a conservative movement. But as you just pointed out, it was a Black radical movement, a mainstream Black nationalist movements. And Du Bois, of course, writes Ethics of the Problem of Palestine, which becomes an op-ed called The Case for the Jews in 1948, where he articulates not just sort of grand aspirations for nationalism, but he uses words like Mohammedism and empty, and phrases like empty land. I mean, he's echoing some very problematic Zionist points.
A lot of people on the left said that. The great Marxist historian Isaac Deutscher, if you look at his writings from the 1950s, he said the same thing about the empty land. Yeah. And truth be told, I'm very much in admiration of Du Bois's commitment to truth. There was a case to be made for the Jews in 1948. And we have to acknowledge that the most moving speech on behalf of Jews at the UN General Assembly in 1947 did not come from the Americans. It came from Gromyko, the foreign minister of Russia. And it was the most ennobling speech one could imagine in the halls of the UN. Because, the Russian people lost 27 million Russians died during World War II.
Right.
And along comes Gromyko, and he said, I wish the Jews and Arabs in Palestine could get along. But if they can't, if there's no possibility of them finding, the term modus vivendi, a way to live together, he said, the Jewish suffering during World War II was such a magnitude that he said, if they can't get along, then they should get a state. That's Gromyko. Yeah. So I think there's an argument there. There are many points where you can discuss this, that, and the other, and make all sorts of what's called caveating.
Let me pick up there just for time's sake, because I want to pivot to something else, and then we're going to come back to this mowing the lawn thing, which I think is incredibly important that we have to talk about. But you just said something that stuck with me a little bit, which is this idea that the events of 1948, or the events leading to 1948, rather, in the minds of many, served as an ample justification for the formation of the state of Israel. And of course, I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea. Well, let me not say that. There are people who would certainly disagree with the idea, with that idea. But again, the devil's always in the detail. As we continue now, last week we saw a House bill, House Resolution 888, which was signed by almost every member of Congress affirmatively. I remember the House of Representatives affirmatively. Rashida Tlaib voted present. One Republican congressman, I believe, voted no. The rest voted yes. And in this resolution, it effectively was arguing ostensibly for Israel's right to exist. And all the whereases that make up a resolution amounted to Jews are ancestrally tied to the land. They've been subjected to persecution throughout the world after they were kicked out of what they now call Israel. That 1948 created a new sense of, the Nazi Holocaust created a new sense of urgency around the formation of the state of Israel. That Jews have a right to self-determination, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that fighting Hamas, it was also in there. The point being, everyone signed this. This was like kissing a baby. This was the most uncontested, resolution I've seen in the House in a long time of such import. And the fact that even the so-called left in Congress, and I'm using that in very sharp air quotes, signed it without comment or without pushback, at least public pushback, brings me to this question that I don't think we ever adequately get to in polite company and in public space. And that is, do we want to concede that Israel has a right to exist, or even to that language? In my book 3 years ago, I raised that question of the right to exist. Again, of course, Jews have a right to exist. Of course, land has a right to countries have a right to have their territorial integrity respected, etc. I'm not talking about safety here, but it seems to me when we just uncritically say and affirm that that Israel has a right to exist, we're really saying Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And if we concede that territory, one, are we giving up too much intellectual and political and moral ground? And two, does that foreclose on all the political possibilities that might actually get us peace in the region?
Look, it's a very fair question. The concept of right to exist originated as from the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 242, the right to exist in peace with its neighbors. That's right. What right to exist means. It didn't bear on the content of the state. It just bore on the fact that Israel is a member state of the United Nations. As a member state of the United Nations, it has the same rights and obligations as any other member state. And one of its rights is the right to live in peace with its neighbors. It's, I think, the second preambular paragraph of UN Resolution 242.
Yes, which is in 1967. Just for the audience, again, this is after the 1967 war. The two major resolutions were 242 and 338. One for ceasefire and two for what Professor Finkelstein is talking about now. Yes, good.
Okay. But obviously the question arises exactly as you pose it. What do you mean by its right to exist as a Jewish state? And there, I think, you have to make discriminations. For example, England defines itself as an Anglican state. Does that self-definition significantly impinge on the rights of non-Anglicans in the UK? I think if you ask most non-Anglicans in the UK, they would say, not very significant in terms of my rights.
Yeah, they might not even know it's an Anglican state.
Right. Excuse me?
I said they may not even know that it defines itself as an Anglican state.
Absolutely correct. The United States is in effect, whether we like it or not, it's in effect a Christian state. Christmas is the national holiday. It's not Hanukkah, and it's not what is the
Eid. There's no. It's not like the Eid. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Christmas. Wake up, smell the coffee. In many ways, this is a a Christian state. Does that really impinge much on my rights as a Jew here? Answer no. I mean, it doesn't break my heart that there is a Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center and not a menorah or whatever. It's not the end of the world for me. And for some Jews, actually, it is a problem because they are very committed to Saturday being the day of Sabbath, if they're religious, rather than Sunday, which is our effective day of Sabbath. And it's not the Muslim Friday either. It's not Friday, it's not Saturday, it's Sunday because we are, or our roots are a Christian, go back to Christianity. So I think what one has to look at is substantively, what does it mean when Israel describes itself as a Jewish state? And when you look at the substance, there's just a very large body of law which discriminates against non-Jews in ways that significantly affect their life chances in Israeli society. That's only one half. That's the Jewish population, the non-Jewish population of Israel. About 20% of the population is,
right.
I think it's 20% is not Jewish. You can
Yep.
correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
But there's a second very fundamental fact. There's only one state at this point between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. There's only one state because under international law, what distinguishes an occupation from an illegal annexation, what distinguishes it is one fundamental fact. An occupation is temporary. If it's not temporary, it's an illegal annexation. Now, Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza in 1967. We're already at 2023, headed towards 2024.
My God.
I don't think anybody can seriously make the case that this is temporary anymore. This is permanent. It's been annexed. So if you look at the population, there are 14 million people living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. 14 million. Of those 14 million, 5 million, namely the inhabitants of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, have no rights whatsoever. They don't have the right of citizenship and everything that derives from citizenship. They have no rights whatsoever. And about 2 million, namely the Palestinian Arabs of Israel, they have some rights, but second-class rights. And so if you say Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state, at this point, the Jewish state includes the West Bank and Gaza. So then you're in effect saying that Israel has the right to completely disenfranchise 5 million people and accord second-class citizenship to 2 million people. Now, if that's your understanding of a Jewish state, I don't see how that can possibly pass muster as a legitimate state. It's no more legitimate than apartheid South Africa was, and the international community reached a consensus, except for Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, reached a consensus that South Africa was an illegitimate state as it was then constituted.
Let me push a little further because I'm already anticipating people saying, well, you know, what's happening in the West Bank has taken longer than expected. Gaza's a mess, but it could be fixed. Let's concede that just for a moment. If Israel were to exist, if we were to get to this magical, elusive, quixotic two-state solution, and suddenly there were a Palestinian state, and all we had left of Israel proper was the actual. I mean, Israel doesn't really have defined borders, but let's just say the territory that we now regard as the West Bank in Gaza is not part of Israel, and the territory that we call maybe even East Jerusalem is not Gaza. Let's say all that is not Israel, and it's just Israel proper. If it were to function the way it does, with a 20% population, roughly give or take, of Arab Palestinians of Israel, as they call them, Palestinian Israelis, and a small population of Druze and some other folk, would it be morally problematic, legally problematic, or otherwise troublesome to be a Jewish state? In other words, I don't want your critique of the Jewish state to rest. I don't want to give you an easy out and have it rest exclusively on the fact that there's an illegal occupation and a siege, right? What do we think about as a more fundamental matter, whether or not the right to an ethno state or religious state or whatever you wanted to call it is okay, and that people, or if people even have a right to it?
As I said, it all depends on the legal and real substance of that ethno state. I think all states have an ethnic component to them. France claims it has this French secular component to itself. It includes Catholicism in its secular identity. Every state has an ethnic component. The question is the extent to which it impinges on the equality of rights of the citizens, bearing in mind that in every state, a majority has certain rights over a minority, namely what we call majority rule. So certain things, in our own constitution,
by virtue of their ethnicity, right? Like I don't get a majority rule. I don't get to control the destiny of the country because I'm African or because I'm Black or because I'm whatever the thing might be.
Yeah, and that's because our Constitution has certain amendments that protect individual rights and protect citizens from various kinds of discrimination. We have that 14th Amendment, which speaks to equality under the law. And that amendment has been interpreted to mean that no majority can command the right to discriminate under the law against any minority. Also, by the way, against majorities like whites, it's been interpreted, in the course of the, as you know, affirmative action cases, that you can't also, under the law, discriminate against white people. So you have both majority rule, but also protections for minorities within the context of majority rule. If you ask me, Israel, roughly speaking, these things are so rough and ready. It resembles the situation when we're talking about Israel. I'm talking about pre-June 67 Israel, not the West Bank, not Gaza, not East Jerusalem. It's more or less the American South before the Civil Rights era. The various kinds of impingements on Black rights here. Yes, the Palestinians have the right to vote in Israel. That's true. But technically, Black people had the right to vote too. It was just that there were all sorts of ways to block them from voting, or making it very difficult for them to vote. So I would say that there's really no such thing as a pure secular state. I think states always have what you might call an ethnic shadow to them. And then the question is, how obtrusive is that shadow in the life of ordinary citizens? And in the case of Israel, it clearly, pre-June 67, it clearly has a a significant impact. There are so many laws, and everything from serving in the army and all the rights you get from serving in the army, but Arabs, with the exception of Druze, can't serve in the army. So you lose all the rights, everything from scholarships to this, to that, to that, to that, which derive from army service.
Yeah.
So that's how I would see it. I have to say, if we had achieved a situation where Palestinians in the occupied, I don't believe they're occupied anymore, in the illegally annexed territories, were able to live a reasonably decent life, to quote Coleman Hughes, a middle class, a middle developing country, then I would say things wouldn't be so terrible. And
Right.
then people in Israel could have their right. They would fight, launch a civil rights struggle, and hopefully gain enough support that they can gain their rights as African Americans did during the civil rights era. But that's not the situation we're living in. The situation we're living in is 5 million people without any rights. Of those 5 million people, 2.5 million people have been living in a concentration camp. And the people in the other half, the West Bank, they're now facing a very real danger, and I think it's a very realistic one, of a mass ethnic cleansing.